Evelyn Garcia Morales, must also be held accountable. Dr. Larson Mitchell has failed her first test. And this is yet another example of why we need stronger leadership, and it reconfirms why we believe that Dr. Larson Mitchell is not qualified to be the next superintendent. This comes at a time where our educators should be focusing on providing instruction and wraparound services for our students. In the last 48 hours, I have heard from frontline educators who have shared their uncertainty and mistrust of CCSD. They are stressed and concerned about how cuts will negatively impact students. It is unacceptable to expect the burden of the mismanagement of CCSD to fall on the shoulders of our students and our educators. And let me be clear, not one student, not one educator should be negatively impacted by the mismanagement and the leadership of Dr. Larson Mitchell. And so with that, I'd like to hand it over to the Executive Director, John Bellardita.
Thank you for everyone who has come today. But first I want to start by thanking all the whistleblowers that are in the schools. If it had not been for principals and educators that flagged a significant problem around a budget and the diligent work on the members of the press, this is another incident that may have been swept under the rug. So I want to start by saying kudos to the whistleblowers that are on the front line. This morning I had a conversation with Governor Lombardo about what's going on in the school district, and I'll share with you the outcome of that conversation in a minute, but I want to set the context for this. On September 16th, we started to hear reports from the schools that people were saying that we had a deficit in a number of these schools, and that might result in a reduction of staff or larger class sizes. And this was coming from principals as well as our educators. On September 17th, I sent an email, and you all should have been given a copy of it, that I sent to the CFO, Jason Gowdy, asking for an explanation of what was going on. His response was pretty guarded, in my opinion, didn't really give details, framed what was going on as what's normal at this time of the year, which is, hey, we do a student census count, and if there's a reduction in students at a school, then a school has to reconcile its budget accordingly. Apparently the problem was greater than that. From that point forward, I received nothing but radio silence from the CFO as well as the school district. 2 days ago, I heard from the superintendent of public instruction, Joan Ebert, inquiring as to what was going on. How could there be a discussion of deficits when the school district received significant amounts of money? And we had an explanation, or I provided an explanation as much as we understood it at that time. And then this morning, as I said, we had a conversation with Governor Lombardo about this. So what is the problem that we have, right? The district issued a statement, I believe, yesterday that essentially said that the CFO has been relieved of their duty. And that would leave some to believe that it was just an error on the part of one individual. And we don't accept that. We feel that there's a systematic problem of incompetence and mismanagement that's going on in CCSD, and that the release of the CFO is essentially a political scapegoat for the Brenda Larson Mitchell administration. And I'll explain that in a minute. But what we're seeing also is a systematic program of cover-up on the part of the CCSD. And this isn't the first time this has happened. In fact, their communications department should be renamed as the cover-up department. And you, as members of the press, have reported a number of these examples, whether it was their radio silence on the Durango incident or their radio silence on the junkets, the hiring junkets. that took place last summer in Hawaii, in Miami Beach, whether it was the concerted effort to address the vacancy that Trustee Williams had, and after persistent inquiries by the community and the press, and then a filing of a complaint with the district attorney, came to light that in fact she wasn't vacant. What we have had is a systematic approach to any inquiry about what's going on at CCSD as a cover-up. People don't talk about it. And this is the latest example. And the reason why there's sunshine on this incident is, again, I'll go back to the whistleblowers that brought attention to this and the fact that the press picked this up. So what kind of problem do we have here in relation to this? And why do we think this is not just the fault of one single individual, the CFO, but it's a result also of the failed leadership of the current administration? So I just want to educate you to the process of how the money gets developed and how budgets are approved in Clark County School District. So in December of 2023, CCEA and the school district reached an agreement for a new 2-year contract, December of 2023. The fiscal impact on the 2-year budget that the district had for fiscal year 24 and fiscal year 25, which is the year that we're in now, was known at that time by CCSD what that would cost the school district moving forward to develop a budget. That was December of 2023. The schools were issued a baseline budget starting in January, February of 2024 to work on their budgets. That baseline budget was provided to them by the Clark County School District. And from that point forward, those schools worked on a budget. It was at that point that the information that Central gave to the school districts was wrong, that they failed to factor in the additional costs for the second year of the contract for salary increases. This is with an understanding and approval, not just by the CFO, but the interim superintendent at that time, that these school districts or these schools received their baseline budgets. The budget that then was developed district-wide was presented in March and then ultimately approved by the school board trustees. So the current budget that we have now was approved by the current school board trustees, and that's the budget that we're operating on when we started the school year. This budget presented to the trustees was presented to them by Brenda Larson Mitchell and her team. So the budget that was faulty because of negligence of gross proportions that started at the beginning of the calendar year, that schools built budgets around, that ultimately the school board trustees adopted for the budget for the entire district, was under the leadership of Brenda Larson Mitchell. And so when these schools had their count day, which is typical at this time of year as to how many students do we have in a school, and reconciled whether or not there was a drop in student census in that school, and then have to reconcile their budgets, that's when those schools started to learn that the budget that they had been told to operate on was a faulty budget. And if you can read the communication between myself and Jason Gowdy, not once in that communication does he own up to the fact that he failed to build into that budget, with Larson Mitchell's approval, failed to build into that budget the 8% or more additional costs for fiscal year 25 that these schools had to operate on. So then all of a sudden what happened was the district took a position initially that the schools had to reconcile these budgets, and in some case that meant deficits. And what does a deficit mean at a school site? It means less staff potentially, larger class sizes, less programs, after school, etc. And so had this not come to light, what we then would have seen is the district's effort to cover up this problem by having schools at their site try to make ends meet with the reduced budgets. Now, we don't know to this day the extent of this problem, but we have heard from several schools where it is not inconsequential, the amount of the deficit. In fact, there isn't an example that we have heard up to this point where it doesn't mean a reduction in staff and possibly larger classes. The irony of this is the school district started the school year with at least 1,000 vacancies, even after hiring a number. So on the one hand, we have these vacancies that we haven't filled, and on the other hand, they're being told, these schools, to reconcile your budgets if there's a deficit, and if it means reducing staff, do that. This is absolutely not just ludicrous, but incompetence to the highest level. How can the community have any confidence in this school district after the significant amount of money that the legislature and the governor provided, when now we're being told at the school site level that we have less money than what we started? I want to spend a moment and share with you what our position has been consistently with this, with the superintendent of public instruction as well as the governor. The burden of this error should not be placed at the school site. As Marie has spoken about, if it's placed at the school site, then the victims of that burden are students, educators, other staff, including principals. The burden should shift to CCSD in terms of if there is a school that has a deficit as a result of this problem, CCSD should backfill that deficit. And the question is, do they have the money? And we've spoken to a few of you in the past, and we clearly have spoken to the governor that they in fact do have the money. They have at least 3 key sources of money that can be drawn from. They have $258 million in carryover dollars. They have $159 million available from the ending fund balance, of which half of that could be used by their own policy. That's another $80 million. And then if there is 1,000 vacancies that the district still hasn't filled, they have budgeted for those vacancies. And so as long as they're not filled, they're called salary savings. And on the low end, that is probably about $90 million, and on the high end, $120 million. And so what I've outlined is close to $500 million is available. So not one school should have to find and make decisions if they have a deficit as a result of the error on the part of the school district when there's these available resources. It's just unacceptable. The other thing that I want to raise and highlight is we think this problem goes deeper than what we have seen. There are major contracts with vendors that have taken place. There have been major financial decisions that this administration and the previous administration did with public funds. And our conversations with the governor in particular have been, we need oversight. We need intervention. We need an investigation as to how deep does this problem go where there's been mismanagement of public funds, funds that should go to the classroom for the student, the frontline educators, and all other staff that try to provide an education to these kids. So that brings me to our conversation and what our ask of Governor Lombardo is. We're asking for an immediate intervention where there's an investigation of this matter. We have no trust or confidence that anybody in the school district can carry out an investigation to get down to not only the bottom of this, but to review significant decisions around money that's been made. We also believe that the president of the school board, Garcia Morales, should be held accountable as the president as to how something like this has happened. Her track record of accountability and transparency has been suspect. We've criticized her publicly on how she shielded, we will use that word, insight into whether or not the former trustee of District B, Katie Williams, had legal residence to maintain her trusteeship. And so we believe that the second thing that should happen is an accountability of the role of Brenda Larson Mitchell. We think it goes without saying that Garcia Morales also should be investigated in terms of her role. We also believe that not one school, not any student, no front-line educators should pay the price of this error. We also believe that in regards to the superintendent search, we have the following to say. We think we're in a very political environment right now. And what do I mean by that? We're looking for a superintendent for this school district. There's been a number of applications that have been put in for it. One application that clearly wants it is the current interim superintendent. In fact, back in February, there was an effort on the part of Garcia Morales and Brooks to not only give Superintendent Jarr at the time a $500,000 payout, but usher in the permanent placement of Superintendent Brenda Larson Mitchell. So Brenda Larson Mitchell has applied for this job on a permanent basis, and then this problem breaks, a problem of gross proportions. So getting rid of Jason Gowdy as the CFO, we believe he's the fall guy to take any kind of effort to find out what her role is. And so for that reason alone, we think that she should withdraw her consideration to be a permanent superintendent, her candidacy for that. And then finally, what we would like to share with you and the public is every parent that's out there that has students in these schools should be asking, how did this happen? This is not the fault of the governor and the legislature, where they made significant investments in education. This is not the fault of any principal at each school that's trying to make do with their budget and make sure that they have the right staff. This is not the fault of any frontline educator that's trying to teach every kid that's in front of them. And we encourage every parent to contact not just their trustees, but to make very loud and clear their concern over the situation. And with that, we can now take some questions.
Do you think that with the discussion of these budget issues that the legislature could consider not giving another round of historic funding to our schools? Is that a concern of yours after everything that's happened this last few weeks, the last few months?
Absolutely. I mean, our experience is twofold. CCA feels it's our burden as an organization to advocate for our students and educators up in Carson City for the adequate funding that we need down here. One of the things that we have to answer when we advocate is the money being spent for a student's education. Is the money being spent wisely? And every time there's things like this, it makes it much more difficult to make an argument that we need additional funding. When we have stories, particularly around, geez, all of a sudden we don't have any more money at some of these schools that's breaking over the last couple of days, it does put at risk these students. And that's why we suggest that parents should get more involved, because nobody should pay the price for the incompetence and the mismanagement of this leadership of this school district, and nobody should pay the price for their systematic cover-up for all of the mismanagement that's been going on.
What has been the communication between the district and CCA regarding the possibilities of staffing surpluses and all of that, and what the principals are having to consider. Has the district reached out to you at all to say, hey, some educators may be surplus because of these budget issues?
No, we have had nothing but radio silence from CCSD.
Do you have any idea on which schools, because it's not all the schools that were told to reconcile their budgets, do you have any idea on which schools were told that?
So we don't know the magnitude of how many schools that are affected by this, and we also know that some schools that did have a deficit felt that they could just fix that deficit with some of their carryover dollars, and this is part of the information that we need to determine how widespread. But I will say this, that the schools that have the highest vacancies, which is primarily these Title I schools, and there's at least probably 220 or more of those schools, many of them would fall under this issue as to whether or not they're now facing deficits moving forward. But we don't know the magnitude or the specifics of which schools are affected by this. Other questions?
Can you share anything more about the conversations you've had with the governor or the superintendent, the feedback that you've gotten from them?
I think the governor takes this matter very seriously. And we can't tell the governor what to do, but what we have done is we flagged an issue that essentially said, here's the problem, and two, we have no confidence in the current administration or the current governance of the school board to address this problem in a satisfactory way and take corrective action moving forward so it doesn't happen again, and we're looking for assistance from his office. We're leaving it up to the governor as to what his authority is and to what extent his involvement will be on that. We're going to respect that. What we're doing is we're highlighting to the highest office in the state what this problem has, and we think it's appropriate for it to do it. We have gotten a very positive feedback as a result. So that's all I can say in terms of what they may do or not do. That'll be their purview.
Can you just walk, I know you mentioned a few dates. You mentioned December was when the contract was agreed upon, and then in March was when the Board of Trustees formally saw it. And Jason Gowdy, from my understanding, was a part of the negotiation team. When do you believe Brenda Lawson-Mitchell has some sort of idea that the numbers aren't adding up?
Well, let me say this. She was appointed the interim superintendent the moment Jara's resignation was accepted. So from that point forward, it is her responsibility to understand that a number of things, but primarily that budget, right? So we have to assume that she was either missing an action of her responsibilities or she's incompetent and doesn't understand finances for a budget to be proposed to these trustees that had a major miscalculation in it.
You mentioned that Jason Gowdy has essentially been the scapegoat in this budget issue situation, but do you think, regardless of that he should have been released from the district?
I'm not going to speak as to whether or not he should be released. I think that the error here rose to the level, in our opinion, of termination. But, you know, we think that there's probably more behind this, right? So, for example, the replacement for Gowdy is part of Gowdy's team, right? And so it should be questioned as to whoever is now going to be the interim CFO, when did you know it, how much did you know, and what was your role? Because if it's more of the same, then I think it's fair game to question, you know, why that person is in charge. Any other questions? Okay, then that concludes our press conference. Tell the press if they want to introduce digital.